So today I want to talk about ghost forests. Ghost forests are a product of climate change that have been unfortunately occurring with increasing frequency in more regions and over wider areas per region. I feel like they're generally not talked about quite as often as some of the other outcomes of climate change, such as, say, forest fires, largely due to them being less of a sign of an immediate danger for humans and more of a harbinger of future disasters that are looming on the horizon. That said, they're one of the most obvious examples that we can point to and say that this is definitive evidence that climate change is happening and having a tangible effect right now, as lush green forests are slowly transformed into white, dead husks of their former selves in the matter of years. So, what exactly is a ghost forest? Well, according to the National Ocean Service, a ghost forest is the watery remains of a once verdant woodland. We have one on screen, an example from Capers Island, South Carolina. As sea levels rise, more and more salt water encroaches upon the land. That advancing and invading the seawater ends up overtaking the fresh water that deciduous trees rely upon for sustenance. The salty water slowly poisons the living trees, leaving a haunted ghost forest of dead and dying timber. So basically, that's what a ghost forest is. Now, researchers have reported that the rapid increase in the ghost forests actually represents a dramatic visual picture of environmental changes along coastal plains located at or near sea level. It's really hard to deny that the climate is changing when you literally have a physical example that one can look at, not just through pictures or through satellite images, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But for people who live in the area, they can walk up to the edge of the forest and literally see trees transforming from these green, lush, beautiful trees into these white husks that are slowly starting to die and fall over. And you can see that literally happening in front of your eyes. And over a span of years, it isn't just one or two trees, it's a matter of an entire forest. People are seeing this change actually occur in their lifetime. And that's making it a great example for demonstrating just how the climate is in fact changing. And how it's changing is one of the things that we'll also talk about in the course of this video. Now, the Mississippi Delta region of Louisiana has been one of the major areas that have been undergoing this change due to the rising water levels and the sinking of the Earth's crust due to the last ice age. Now, with land and water constantly shifting, woodlands die and are buried in the open water, and North Carolina's maritime forests have also been another major example of this, where once peaceful verdant groves are now ghost forests. Now, when we look more into this, we find that the destruction of an area's crucial biodome and coastal buffer is the effect of this happening. So these thriving forests are a direct result of climate change, as the trees are suffocated by the saltwater intrusion sparked by sea level rise and an uptick in hurricanes and superstorms. So we actually get more information with this, and this is an example that's happening in New Jersey, where white cedar trees have literally devolved into ghost forests. So basically, you have two major issues that are going on here. You have the hurricanes and superstorms and the rising sea levels causing two different forms of disaster. There's the immediate biodome that ends up disappearing, but there's also the coastal buffer that's disappearing as the same land is transformed into ghost forest. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, the biodome represents the forest itself, the creatures that live there, and just the general biome of what a coastal forest looks like and acts like and behaves like. And when we have a coastal buffer, we're referring to it being literally a tool that ends up preventing the water and the stormwater especially from rising up and overtaking areas where human populations are likely to live. That's coastal farmland. That's if that water gets salted, that means you're going to have a destruction of crops. If you have towns that are right near the water, that's going to mean the destruction of living spaces and residential properties. And if you have factories and commercial properties there, that's going to mean the destruction of industry, and that's going to end up leading to chemical spills more than likely that'll end up spilling into the ocean and causing more of the damage that climate change is going to produce. So it's going to kind of cyclically produce on itself if it destroys factories and other such things. Now, if we pay close attention to our environment, we often see that it sends us signals the State Commissioner of Environmental Protection had said, while walking along a ghost forest spanning more than 300 acres in southern New Jersey. This is a signal about the risk that we all face from saltwater intrusion from storm surge. 300 acres into the coast of southern New Jersey. That is a absurd amount. And that, again, is happening because of the amount of storms that we're getting. And of course, we know that the amount of storms that we're getting are increasing because inclement weather is increasing the amount of storms due to the climate changing. And a lot of the storms that would mostly stick into the Gulf of Mexico and maybe up into the Carolinas are now finding themselves with increased strength, traversing all the way into the Northeast into areas like New Jersey, New York, and even parts of Boston and Massachusetts. So this is something that is going to become more of an issue, and it's spreading across these different regions. The Atlantic white cedar forests are seen as the first line of defense on New Jersey's coasts. They thrive in freshwater wetlands, swamps so thick that extreme caution and a good pair of wader boots are necessary in order to walk through them. As sea levels rise, these trees are the first hit, and the saltwater intrusion is killing them due to their sensitive nature. The water will then move on to inundate farm fields, people's homes, drinking water, and businesses. Now, we know that the coastal woodlands are also one of the most critical ecosystems in the United States, as they also filter pollutants and act as a natural barrier and store carbon in the ground. So what's also going to happen here is as this land is slowly devastated by the salt water, you're going to see forms of erosion probably happen that are going to release some of the carbon in the ground, and that's going to make carbon emissions increase. So protecting these forests is something that we really need to do in much greater amounts. Now, in addition to all of this, we can see that in North Carolina, for example, pine, red maple, sweet gum, and bold cypress forests are being replaced with salt marshes. So you're literally seeing the transform of one biome into another. You can't really deny that climate change is happening when you're seeing these lush forests turn into salt marshes. Eventually, that salt marsh will eventually be replaced by open water, a shift that leads to significant and complex costs to the environment and local economies. It's worth noting that large sections of the United States population are built near the coast and are living near the coasts. The cities are mostly coastal, and that a lot of them will be the first ones affected by such changes. The loss of forest will reduce carbon storage, further fueling climate change like I talked about, and the agriculture industry and timber interests will suffer as saltwater moves inland. So as the saltwater moves inland, the forest areas that are near the edge of the coastal forests, which are used for timber production, are going to end up either having to sacrifice their timber production to make that the new buffer zone, or if they continue to increase the amount of timber that they are tearing down and using for their own production purposes, that's going to leave no buffer for farmlands. So it's going to be one group or another that ends up suffering both economically and through their own livelihoods being damaged. So satellite images were actually taken to demonstrate this as well. Satellite images were taken 430 miles above Earth going back more than 30 years. And when we look at that data spanning between 1985 and 2019, we've actually found that there's been a 10% increase in the amount of ghost forest cover during that time. So 10% of the area's tree cover has become ghost forest in the span of maybe 30 years? And that's what we're talking about with this increase, where it's happening over the course of people's lives. People who grew up in these areas and have seen these forests decay have an idea of what kind of climate change that we're dealing with, as they've seen these forests that were, again, lush and green transform into dead husks. And the accelerating transformation of these healthy forests along North Carolina and the rest of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts are an ominous sign as saltwater marches inland. And it's not just in the US. It's also happening in Vietnam, Mexico, Bangladesh, Italy, as it's fouling fresh water and destroying rice paddies, farmlands, and forests. And so this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with. And on screen, I actually have a small animation that shows how the fresh, healthy forest in green is slowly being transformed into these ghost forests, which you're seeing in the red and I believe brown colors that you're seeing there, but mostly the red. And that red is going to keep pushing inward as we see more and more of this forest start to decay over the next 20 to 30 years. And chances are it's going to increase in the amount that we see it as a lot more storms and inclement weather and weird, strange weather conditions that would happen maybe once in a century start to happen more like once in a decade or once every 5 years. These things are going to become more and more commonplace. Now, we also know that the coastal habitats of the United States, as I pointed out earlier, are some of the strongest defenses that we have for protecting inland territories. Surging storms and rising seas threaten millions of U.S. residents and billions of dollars in property along coastlines. The nation's strongest defense, according to a new study by scientists with Natural Capital Project at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, comes from the natural coastal habitats. There's often a move to build these really strong concrete walls to keep the water out, but in reality, in a lot of these situations, it's much better to use the natural environment as a protection. It's worked for hundreds of years beforehand, at least. And there's no reason to think it wouldn't continue to work. So instead of draining swamp areas near the coastal regions and starting to build properties on them, maybe it's best to leave them as a buffer zone and use them to the advantage of people who are living inland. This is making best use of the land and working in a communal fashion to help the communities strive to better results. Of the 25 most densely populated counties in the United States, 23 of them are along the coastline. The study, Coastal Habitats Shield People and Property from Sea Level and Rise of Storms, published in Nature and Climate Change, mapped the entire U.S. coastline and reports that habitats such as seagrasses, mangroves, sand dunes, and coral reefs currently protect 2/3 of the U.S.'s coastlines, including at-risk areas such as New York and Florida. This, in addition to the coastal forests that we've talked about and the swamp beds, are pretty much the way that people are been protected from massive storms historically. Conservation and restoration of shoreline marshes, seagrass beds, oyster beds, coral reefs, dunes, coastal forests, and large kelp forests, or offer natural defense mechanisms for coastlines, buffering them from waves and storm surges. Loss of these habitats would increase the vulnerability of human populations, with the economies of eastern seaboard and Gulf of Mexico expected to suffer the most damage. And while that's true, we've seen that slowly increase up the eastern seaboard as areas like New York and New Jersey are starting to get affected more and more. During the recent storms, we've seen the flooding that's happened in New York City, where the subways were literally so high that people had to wade through them, and some of them couldn't even be entered as high as those water levels were. Now, what's being done about this? Well, there's ghost forests that are being worked on to try to preserve some of the biome. Unfortunately, large swathes of coastal cypress forests have been wiped out across southern Louisiana. Initially, the trees were over-harvested to build houses, railroads, and anything else that needed wood. Later, levees built on the Mississippi River to facilitate navigation and oil and gas extraction pushed saltwater from the Gulf inland as much as 50 miles, and navigation canals were carved into the swamps, causing even more destruction. So just so it's known, humans have been the cause of a lot of this, whether it be the increase in sea levels that we talked about before, or just misuse and mismanagement of the resources that, such as what's been done for the oil and gas extraction, pushing the saltwater inland, creating canals so people could traverse the swamps. All of these have slowly increased the amount of damage that we've done, and after a while, it all starts to break down. Now, preserving the existing coastal forests and replacing some that were lost in the last century is a top priority in Louisiana. The state's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has spent almost $16 million since 2011 to buy coastal forest lands from willing sellers, preserve the habitat, and ensure that the trees are not harvested. About $2 million of this funding, plus another $6.5 million in settlements from the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil disaster, were used to help to expand the swamp wildlife management area down there, and more than 100,000-acre public tract of cypress to Pleo swamp was built in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Nonprofit organizations like the one pictured here have basically worked towards investing hundreds and thousands of dollars and utilize countless volunteer hours to plant cypress trees in areas where overharvest and saltwater intrusion has made it impossible for the trees to regrow on their own. The noble efforts would be fruitless, however, without additional work to limit the saltwater intrusion that initially caused the trees' demise. We actually need to get the salt out of the land and stop, bombarding the land with this salt water. Rebuilding coastal barriers, replenishing marshes and natural ridges with dredged sediment, and building diversions to allow Mississippi River to spill again into its dilatic swamps will keep the Gulf of Mexico at bay and allow coastal forests to grow back into vital fish and wildlife habitat and provide hurricane protection. And so this is generally how we're going to respond to it in the immediate sense. However, I do need to point out, as they mentioned, that this is only a temporary measure. Recreating these forests is not going to work if sea levels keep rising. Eventually, we're going to hit a wall where we're not going to be able to replant these things. So these ghost forests really are a symptom that tell us that indeed climate change is happening, and quite rapidly. We've literally seen situations where green lush forests have transformed into white dead husks within the span of people's lifetimes. Heck, within the span of a child growing up into an adult. However, unless we make actual systemic change, a lot of these efforts are going to result in a losing battle against rising sea levels, largely due to the effects of humans on the climate. No matter how effective we are at preserving these forests in the short term, unless we absolutely reverse course on our fossil fuel productions, our carbon emissions, and seriously consider some models of degrowth, we're going to have to continue to deal with these manifestations of these warning signs like ghost forests that are going to mean more and more disastrous effects in the near future. Once these forests are gone, there's no buffer between most major cities, most major areas and ports, and a lot of the water that's going to flood in and destroy crops and other things. Especially properties and residences, and possibly even industrial factories that are going to spill chemicals as well. This is what we're looking at in the near future without the protection and buffer of these climates. And it's always the consistent destruction of the coastal lines that are going to cause the most harm in the long run. And humans need to stop doing things that are responsible for destroying that if we want to preserve our way of life. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notification. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.